Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to our weekly Kaffeepause. We've been hosting this series with different journalists since March of last year, and I am especially happy to welcome you to the 70th edition of the Kaffeepause, and it seems fitting to have the 70th Kaffeepause during our 70th anniversary year at the American Council on Germany. I'm also very, very happy to invite and include an old friend from Washington, D.C., who's now in Berlin, our guest today, Anja Wehler-Schoeck. She is based in Berlin, where she serves as the newly minted international editor at the German daily Der Tagesspiegel. Anja, herzlich willkommen, and it is wonderful to see you.
Likewise. So thank you so much for the kind invitation, Steve.
So, Anja, I know today is a very busy day for you, but it is wonderful that you've taken the time to talk with us. And I thought we could start by getting your take on what the political mood is like in Germany right now.
Well, you'd think that Germany be ecstatic because there's a soccer World Cup going on in Qatar, but actually much fewer Germans than usual are watching the World Cup because there's been an ongoing debate for the last year or so about the problems with giving the World Cup to Qatar and the corruption involved in this, the problems that migrant workers are facing, repression against LGBTQ community, human rights violations, etc. So a lot of people are actually boycotting at the Soccer World Cup, and it's not the usual soccer celebration. So yeah, this is a different setting. But of course, apart from fun aspects, there is a lot of concern at the moment about the looming energy crisis, about the winter that is coming, and the very high inflation, which is higher than 10% at the moment in Germany. And of course, people then have a lot of sympathy for what's going on in Ukraine. There's a lot of discussion about whether the German government is doing enough and what it could be doing more. And so this is, of course, a topic that's been with us 24/7 since the outbreak of the war.
And I mean, yesterday, of course, was the first Advent. So I assume that the Christmas markets are open and that there's some sort of Christmas Stimmung as well. But it sounds as if the mood is really sort of dominated by these other issues, and really sort of when it comes down to it, concerns over inflation and rising energy costs when it comes to domestic issues.
Exactly. So I would say that this has definitely put a damper on the Weihnachtsstimmung. Christmas markets have opened and people are, of course, celebrating, but still, even day-to-day things have become a lot more expensive, things that you would normally buy at a Christmas market, and people are worried whether they'll be able to take days off or will go on short trips, and so this is generally being felt. And also, we still have a pandemic, so schools and daycares have closed down sometimes, or kids are being sent home. There's a teacher shortage in Germany that's being very harshly felt. So schools and daycares are constantly understaffed. And yeah, there's a lot of concern that the numbers of new variants might be going up again, and there will be new restrictions.
And I mean, I have not looked at the sort of polling data for the last week or so, but how content are people with how the government is handling the range of challenges that you're talking about?
Well, I would say to start with that people are never content with how the government is dealing with things, but Olaf Scholz has taken quite a hit. People at first they were thrilled that he took a major leap with Zeitenwende, but now they've become frustrated with how it's being implemented, or rather how it's not being implemented as it was announced, or whether Germany should be doing more in delivering more specific and far-reaching weaponry to Ukraine. He's not been as popular as he would probably like to. Whereas the Green foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, has been very popular. She's been doing very well on the international stage and done a great job in representing Germany abroad, I'd say.
So let me sort of ask a follow-up about that, because over the summer and into the fall, some of the polling data indicated that 74%, well over 2/3 of the population, was supportive of the government, showing support for Ukraine and really standing side by side with Kyiv and trying to be supportive. And there were lots of questions at that time of how long this sort of solidarity would hold, particularly with the winter coming and with concerns about it being cold, about energy prices going up, about heating prices going up, and just general concerns. How do you think the solidarity is holding? Does it look like it will hold?
Oh yes, and I think there is very little doubt that the majority of the German population is standing right behind the people of Ukraine and their fight against the Russian invasion. And it's very clear to everybody what is at stake there. It's really a small minority of right-wing groups that are discussing whether we should take in Ukrainian refugees, or whether Germany should rethink its position towards Russia and supporting Ukraine. But that's really these are fringe groups. The vast majority of Germans are standing behind the people of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We started our conversation and you mentioned the Soccer World Championship, and we've talked a little bit about the war in Ukraine, but particularly in your new role as international editor, what are some of the major stories that you're following at the moment and focused on at the moment?
Well, I'm currently writing something about the protests in China, which we've, of course, been following very closely. It's fascinating to see the outburst of protests that China is currently experiencing, and we're, of course, wondering if this might end up in a new Tiananmen scenario with lots of people getting hurt. So very closely following that. And similarly in Iran, of course, we've been looking very closely at what is happening in Iran. And it is interesting to see whether this might be at the beginning of a new wave, to look at whether protests, even though they're far apart, might be able to sort of reinforce each other, like a new wave of global strife for freedom and democracy. Mm-hmm. And well, within the EU, we've had, of course, a lot of issues about rule of law breaches, and especially coming from Hungary and Poland. And this week, the EU Commission will formally announce whether it will sanction Hungary for breach of rule of law regulations within the EU and withhold funding, for example. So this is, of course, something that is closer to home when it comes to our foreign policy. And the NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Bucharest and in Romania tomorrow. We'll be looking forward to hear from them what they'll be discussing. Berlin is hosting the Berlin Security Conference this week, so lots of things to observe.
Mm-hmm. Lots of stories to follow, and let me maybe just sort of pick up on a couple of the stories that you've talked about and that you're watching closely. Let's maybe start with the protests in China. It was very interesting this morning on Deutschlandradio. there's always the internationale Presse sort of overview of what the headlines are. And that was one of the leading stories in the international press. But one of the things that one of the Taiwanese papers pointed out is that very few people in China even know about these protests. It's certainly not widely reported. And in cities that have millions of citizens, there are, only hundreds of people who are taking to the streets, but still there are hundreds of people who are protesting and who are taking to the streets, largely because they're not approving of Xi, and because they're not approving of his COVID measures. In one interview that I heard this morning, a Chinese journalist who now lives in the West was saying that made the analogy of the citizens are like water and the leader is like a boat. And so water has the ability to hold a boat up, but it also has the ability to capsize a boat and capsize a leader. How tenuous do you think the situation in China is right now?
Well, I think Xi Jinping is in a very tight spot right now because his person is very closely tied to the zero COVID policy that people are becoming more and more frustrated with. So there is no easy way out. He can't really change his stance towards the zero COVID policy, and it's also hard for him to sort of offer anything to the protesters. So what I assume will happen is that he and his leadership ring will wait for a couple of days, and then we'll probably start a very harsh crackdown on protesters.
In that regard, it does sort of bring back memories of Tiananmen Square, and you talked earlier about the question of whether there's a new Tiananmen scenario. This is also something that many younger Chinese people are not familiar with, right? It's not something that is taught in school. It's not something that's reported on. That there was this sort of pushback in 1989. There were these protests in 1989. How do you see that sort of unfolding, and what do you see as sort of the role of the next generation?
Well, I think the next generation is extremely important, and when it comes to questioning these patterns, and we see that in China, we see that in Iran, but of course, both countries and China, probably even more technologically advanced, have found ways to control social media and restrict the information intake. And I know that in China, any message or email that mentions Tiananmen automatically gets filtered out. So as you mentioned, we have a whole generation that hasn't grown up knowing about Tiananmen, what happened. So of course this impacts them in their take on their country. But what I think we're seeing is that and there's a curiosity, there's a frustration that's been growing for 4 decades now, and that's finding an outburst. And then in these situations, people become creative, and technological restrictions can get circumvented.
Mm-hmm. So moving from one protest to another, but sticking with this notion of creativity, as you look at what's unfolding in Iran right now, do you see the protesters also bringing sort of a creative bent to some of their protests and some of their pushing back against the regime?
Yeah, and even more than creativity and that we've seen with songs and other art forms being used in the protests, I think they're incredibly persistent, and we can only applaud them for their immense bravery, because there's been so much violence in the pushback, and still the protests are going on. That for me, that's really a sign of how deep felt their frustration with the regime it must be, that they're just not afraid anymore. It's enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, of course, that the NATO foreign ministers are meeting this week, that in Berlin there's also a security conference that's taking place this week. We've all been following very closely, or at least as closely as one can from far away, the fact that the German government is drafting a national security strategy, and on the heels of that, a China strategy. Initially, this national security strategy was supposed to be released before the end of the year. It now looks like both strategies will be released in January of next year, although we're finding out a little bit more about some of the contours of what these look like. What are your expectations of this security conference in Berlin? And do you have any insights into what the tenets of the national security strategy might be?
So the Berlin Security Conference is a non-government conference. So it's sort of like the Warsaw or the Munich Security Conference. It's a privately organized gathering, but of course politicians and state function holders attend. So Olaf Scholz will be there, and Norway is the partner country, so his Norwegian counterpart will also attend. And the European North has, of course, been a very important region over the last few months, and this will be at both events, the NATO Foreign Ministers Gathering and the Berlin Security Conference. This will be a major topic because Sweden's and Finland's NATO accession has, of course, been very warmly welcomed by the European partners here. But of course, we're still facing the challenge of convincing Turkey to unblock its decision and allow NATO access for both countries. And there will be, what I'm hearing, there will be a Turkish delegation in Sweden early this week. So we'll see what comes from there. But I also recently attended the Helsinki Security Forum, and it was very interesting to see on the ground what these two countries will bring to NATO and how they will strengthen our defense in the north.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, these discussions are all probably overshadowed by the situation in Ukraine and next steps in the Ukraine as well. Are you seeing, the solidarity question, right? The West has shown tremendous solidarity vis-a-vis Ukraine in light of Russia's war there. That seems to be holding within NATO as well. But to what degree is there discussion also about some sort of a solution to this conflict?
Well, I think the partners have been very clear that Russia has to fully withdraw before there will be any negotiation. And I think it's important to stick to that line and to not cave in front of Russia's evident breach of international law. So yeah, it's a very gloomy scenario, and I think it's shocking to see how low Russia stoops at the moment, attacking infrastructure, causing hunger and people to suffer from the cold, and that will only get worse. So I think we'll see a lot of awful news from Ukraine going forth, and that means we need to do everything in our power to support the people there and to alleviate their pain.
Mm-hmm. So the policy elites, seem to be rallying around this notion of a national security strategy and then also a China strategy to help shape Germany's sort of position on the world stage, Germany's direction moving forward when it comes to foreign and security policy, even though it falls short of the creation of a national security council, which some politicians and some in government had wanted to see. How closely is this process of creating a national security strategy being followed by the public, and how is it resonating with the public? Is it an issue for the man or woman on the street?
That I would say no. So it's mostly like a policy wonk issue. So of course, people in our network follow it and discuss it. But the man and the woman on the street, I don't think they follow it or they care. And you mentioned the National Security Council, so Germany doesn't have one, but the issue of coordination between different departments is in fact a major concern. And for both the China and the national security strategy that are coming forth in the next few weeks, that will be essential. Will we manage to have sort of one government policy and not the Foreign Office being very concerned with the human rights situation in China and with the political system, and the Ministry of Economic Affairs saying, well, but we need a lot of trade. So that will be one of the central aims of both strategies to make sure that there is more coherence between the different government agencies.
So switching gears for just a moment, you talked a little bit earlier about what's going on within the EU, and you mentioned Hungary and Poland. But I'd like to ask you about sort of your take on the state of the Franco-German relationship. Last week we saw some visits to Paris, but this relationship seems to be particularly fraught at the moment. And really it's the relationship between Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz that seems to be somewhat tense, at least to the outside observers. Where do you see the Franco-German relationship going in the short term to the midterm?
Well, you have to understand that I'm really a child of the Élysée Treaty. So growing up, I did so many exchanges with France. I can't even tell you how many that was. I did part of my university studies in France. So for my generation, France is such a close partner. We can't even fathom going to war. And I think that's quite fascinating, because it used to be only a little time ago our arch enemy that we historically went to war with quite a lot. So for me, this partnership is unshakable. And of course, like in every relationship, there is sometimes fighting. There are different points of view, and I think there are a lot of concerns on the table right now. But I'm absolutely positive that the relationship is so strong that it won't be shaken by this, and that these problems that are on the table right now will be overcome, and will go forth as the strong German-French tandem that we are.
I mean, I think that's certainly the hope. Right, and I think that's also the sort of beacon for the future. But the question is, how can we, see greater alignment between Berlin and Paris, particularly on some of these, sticky policy issues that seem to exist, and also at the same time, sort of a sense of one-upmanship. I mean, for example, there had been some discussion about Macron and Scholz visiting Kyiv together and showing sort of a sign of Franco-German unity and of European unity vis-a-vis Ukraine. And of course, that didn't happen, right? Each of them is I mean, Scholz visited, Macron is slated to visit. Similarly with China and with relations to Xi, there were discussions about doing this together. So the question for me is how can we see greater alignment between the two countries?
Well, I think joint visits are indeed a good start and have a high symbolic value. And I think it would have been a great statement if Macron and Scholz had gone to China together. I think it would have immensely strengthened our position and the European position towards China. So I think a joint visit to Kiev would also be, but there are many avenues for cooperation. There's a German-French initiative in the Balkans, for example, and there's a German-French initiative in air defense. So I think there are many projects that bear great value. And of course, there are also difficulties when it comes to energy supply and others where there have been decisions that were hard to compromise on.
Mm-hmm. So I know, as I said at the outset, Anja, that today is a very busy day for you because you have a big project that will be released tomorrow. And so I'd like to maybe close with a question about the Tagesspiegel. The international reporting at the Tagesspiegel has been expanded, and you'll be kicking off that relaunch tomorrow. What can you tell us about the relaunch and why this is important for the paper, but also for your readers?
So historically, the Tagesspiegel is a Berlin newspaper, so a local and regional paper, and our publisher always aimed to establish it as a strong national paper. And so with this kickoff, the aim is to strengthen the national profile of Tagesspiegel. And going forth, we will change to tabloid format, so we'll be smaller. It will be stapled in the back and much easier to read on a train. And it will be 2 books. So the first book will be national and international news. And the second book will be Berlin and Brandenburg. So the aim is to strengthen the national profile and strengthen international coverage, but also maintain the great coverage of Berlin and Brandenburg that the Tagesspiegel is famous for.
Mm-hmm. And so how does that affect some of the international focus that you work on?
So I was actually hired only a few months ago to build the new international department, because before Tagesspiegel didn't have an international department, and it was sort of, international news was sort of done in the political section. But with the relaunch, there's really a new focus on expanding international coverage, and we've built a worldwide network, and it's also our publisher's vision to have more external expertise in the paper. So going forth, we'll have a lot more opportunities to write op-eds for us. So we're in contact with a lot of think tanks and other institutions where people can contribute their expertise on Africa or developments in Asia, Latin America. So we're going many new paths in different fields.
And how much of this will be available online?
And everything will be available online. So we're one editorial team, so all the content that goes into the paper is available online, and some of it is paywalled, of course, but everything is available online. Well,
Anja, I wish you the best of luck tomorrow with this relaunch, and I want to thank you for joining us today for this conversation. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about, and we covered a number of topics from the 30,000-foot level. But hopefully we can drill into some of these topics in the coming months. But for now, herzlichen Dank, and thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and it will be my pleasure to return to one of your formats. I'm sorry that I've only got so little time today, but let's do this again sometime.
We will. I'm happy to do it again. Of course, tomorrow is a big day for you, but it's also an important day for the American Council on Germany, because tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. And so I just want to remind our viewers that if you like what we do, if you want to support our work, then please consider making a donation to the ACG on this Global Day of Giving. But for now, thank you for tuning in. And Anja, a very big thanks to you for taking the time on this busy day.
Of course. Thank you. My pleasure, Steve.